Hello, and welcome to Walking the Shadowlands podcast. Let me be your guide as we take a walk into the shadowy realms of the unexplained, the paranormal, of things that go bump in the night and haunt your dreams.
Your hosts,
I'm Marianne, and I would like to welcome you to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, today, whatever time it is, wherever you are living in this beautiful world of ours. So sit back, relax, and let me be your guide as we walk into the Shadowlands together and discover what awaits us there. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the second part of our episode on Skinwalkers. I first contacted my guest through their postings on Reddit. I'm not going to try and pronounce their username because I can't. I have tried and failed miserably, and I'll only embarrass myself if I try again. I saw their post, which I'll read out in a second, followed by an experience my guest's sister had with a skinwalker. Then we'll return to our conversation with my guest. So, grab that blanket and hot drink, sit back and relax if you can. Let's begin. In the traditional Navajo way, skinwalkers are seen as witches, but they weren't always seen that way. My late grandmother, who was a medicine woman that practiced the blessings way, told me of the origins of the skinwalker. Being a skinwalker wasn't always seen as a bad thing. In fact, they were seen as people with amazing gifts. They could change into the form of any animal, run vast distances quickly, mimic people's voices, and were known to use magic. During colonization, skinwalkers were used to relay messages between war camps and spy on the enemy without being detected. Having the skinwalker abilities was a gift. When we lost, the good of the community took a back seat and people began to focus on themselves. Instead of sharing what you had, people began to look after their own families, claiming property and livestock, and there were people that got the short end of the stick. Jealousy is a terrible thing. People became jealous of one another, wanted more fortunate people to lose what they had. They looked to skinwalkers who had otherworldly powers to do their bidding. Now, being a skinwalker is not a gift. You condemn yourself to a life of unhappiness and anger. In order to become a skinwalker, you must sacrifice someone that you love very much. This shows that you are indeed committed to depravity. The interesting thing is that you could have met a skinwalker and not even know it. They are people like you or me that have chosen a path in which they will hurt others. Navajos want to separate themselves from death of any kind. We burn clothing and personal items of deceased relatives, and it is very taboo to keep anything that belongs to the dead. Keeping such items can make a person sick or suffer horrible events in their life. However, skinwalkers surround themselves with death. Skinwalkers have been known to grave rob and search through people's garbage. They use bones and hair from the dead and victims' personal items to create bundles. They place these bundles near a person's home and bad luck will fall upon the person. The reason I bring this up in my upcoming stories, I'll start addressing the bundles and retelling skinwalker stories from my immediate family and myself. In her younger days, my sister was very much interested in the rodeo scene. My family actually has a pretty impressive legacy when it comes to the sport. My sisters didn't compete but had plenty of friends and family that they would go and watch. My two sisters would travel around the southwest following the rodeo circuit. The cowboy lifestyle isn't always glamorous. It can be filled with alcoholism, drugs, and depression. Unfortunately, this took hold of my sister and she got in trouble with the law. My sister was looking at jail time and the family was very concerned about what might happen to her. This was very out of the ordinary for her. My mother went to a local medicine man and they talked about the next steps. They decided to have a ceremony for my oldest sister. A few days passed and it was time for the ceremony. The medicine man and his wife showed up a little past dusk. They came into our house and we served them the food we had prepared. Everyone chatted for a bit, and when we finished eating and cleaned up, it was time to start. Everyone sat down in the living room in a large circle. The medicine man sat on the far west side of the room. My oldest sister sat to his left. In the middle of the circle was a large pile of sand that was smoothed out on top. My uncles got hot coals from the fire and placed them on the sand. The medicine man prayed in Navajo and sang blessing songs. This went on into the night. At the height of the ceremony, the medicine man turned to my older sister and told her that they would have to go outside and pray in the darkness. He told her not to look around as she is singing. He told her to keep her eyes on him. The medicine man, my sister, and my uncle went outside. The medicine man turned around and began singing in the darkness. My sister was watching him sing, trying to keep her focus on only him. Then she heard it. Off in the distance, she heard someone whistle. This made her feel sick to her stomach. Our elders tell us about our culture's taboos starting at a young age. One of the biggest things that they stress is to never whistle at night. They tell us only the dead whistle at night. So, when my sister heard whistling out in the darkness, fear gripped her heart. She was so scared that tears began to well up in her eyes. The whistling got louder and louder, as if whatever it was moving closer and closer. My uncle was also outside during the prayer. He admits that he was scared too, but he wanted to be there for my sister. What my uncle saw was even more miraculous. He claims that as the medicine man sang, a bundle came from up above. The eagle feathers that the medicine man was holding opened up like a hand. The bundle gently floated down into the feathers, and the feathers closed around the bundle. The medicine man stopped singing and the group went back into the house. My sister stumbled in, clearly shaken from the experience. The medicine man could see how my sister was. She asked him what was whistling. He told her that it was the Skinwalker and that he was trying to call the bundle back to it. We gathered around to see what was in the bundle. The medicine man opened up what looked to be a leather pouch. Inside of the pouch was a bone about 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. Upon closer inspection, the bone was hollowed out and more items were shoved inside of the bone, held in place with twigs and dirt. He dissected the bone to find hair and pieces of a shirt, both belonging to my sister, and a very tiny drawing of a woman behind bars. Whatever was calling out to this bundle had very ill intentions for my sister. Fortunately, after the ceremony, all of my sister's charges were dismissed. I asked my sister what they did with the bundle and she said that she wasn't really sure. She says that she vividly remembers being very scared when they were outside singing. My sister controls her emotions very well, and so I can't even begin to fathom how scared she must have felt in that moment. Personally, I find it hard to believe that these events are merely coincidental. Do you fear for your own safety sharing this information?
I sometimes. So in terms of like writing my stories online, yeah, I've had this fascination with the lore, and I personally I do believe that they are real,
Right.
and I've had my own experiences that have made me believe that there's something out on the reservation that's kind of insidious and not necessarily in my best interest.
Right. Can you please explain for listeners why this topic is really, if ever, discussed?
Okay, so what essentially like the it's interesting because it kind of seems, and what I've been told about it in terms of my personal experience, is that they, because they are like a supernatural entity, they are aware of when people are talking about them.
Right.
So when you start talking about them, the elders always mention that, you know, don't talk about them. They start coming around when you talk about them. And so, in terms of like my me being anonymous and writing these stories from a place of, I don't want anyone to know my identity, is because I do believe in them. I know I've had my own experiences, and I do. There is a level of fear in terms of like, oh, I'm writing these stories, I'm putting them out on the internet, and I do have a level of fear that if my identity is found out, that they're going to start coming around and I'm going to start experiencing, you know, essentially, misfortune and travesty in my life that, I'm not up to. And in reality, I haven't, like, like a handful of people know that I write these stories. But like in my immediate family, I have not told, like I've told my sister and I've told my mother, but anybody else, like my aunts, my uncles, who are some of the people that have shared their stories, do not know that I've shared these stories.
Right. Well, honestly, I think you're incredibly brave because I know that culturally it goes against what I've read of what's acceptable and not acceptable. So I think for you to share it, that's really a very brave thing. And I understand the fear, and it's really interesting how they didn't start out that way but turned that way. That actually makes me feel very sad. It makes me feel very sad because obviously they were a force for positiveness at the beginning.
And I think, like, and this is, simply speculation, but I feel like as, the generations went on, like, people did start getting jealous towards the beginning. And then, like, it was more of a yin and yang towards the beginning where, like, there was some good, some bad. But generally, as, the generations went on, there was probably a stigma of, like, oh, well, if you're a skinwalker, you're bad. And so instead of, I do want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, like, you know, there is that stigma against you, and you you do bad because you're expected to do bad. And like, so in terms of like the medicine women and the people that practice the blessing way, when they do provide a service. And so I think on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have skinwalkers who people do, essentially contract to do their bidding. And essentially, you never know. It may just be their job.
Right.
I'm sure that it's like people come to them wanting, that are jealous and that use their gifts to essentially do bad on people. And I'm sure that, that like, I assume like it's I try to connect it to an occupation. So like where medicine women, medicine men do provide blessing services, I'm sure like maybe it could be just an occupation for those skinwalkers who have these gifts, but their occupation is to bring misfortune to others. Maybe they're not necessarily bad people. As I mentioned before, I don't know if you know, but people like your neighbor could be a skinwalker and you wouldn't even know.
that was that was going to be my next question to you. You just beat me to it. You don't know? There's no way you can tell that a person's a skinwalker, male or female?
No, not at all. And in my previous stories, there was a woman around the community that in multiple stories where the person is found out to be a skinwalker and they lose their lives. And it's interesting because I think that's why they I don't know, to me it's kind of funny the way I think about it is like they have a punch card, they put on their skins and they go out and you know have shenanigans in their you know skins and then come back. And there's I really try not to be disrespectful in terms of like my metaphors, but I can honestly think like my grandmother provided those blessing services, and she did receive compensation for her blessing services. And so I'm wondering if just it's just a day at the office for them. They put on their clothes, they put on their attire, they do their job, and then they come home and you know, as me or you would, come home, try to relax, try to forget about their day. I honestly don't know if it's like that or if it's, a little bit deeper and they're essentially are evil. I do try to give, everybody the benefit of the doubt.
Perhaps they started out as nice people at one stage, but got corrupted by the power that this ability gives them.
Yeah, like it could essentially be that they are drunk with power.
Yeah,
It's interesting because I've I've also heard like from multiple things of like if you choose to walk this path, you're essentially shortening your life. And so I guess they do try to get the best of what they have right now, and essentially they live this half life, and not necess- I don't necessarily know if they're happy or not, but like I I I it's a shame that there are people out there, if they do have this gift or curse, whatever it may be, that are living their lives, with this stigma of like you're evil, you you're evil, and that's all we know about you. And but see, the thing is, if you have multiple experiences where they are all bad, you're people are going to assume that you are a bad person.
right, right.
So unless, some random chance of like, you know, uh, somebody has a good story about these skinwalkers, then, you know, that could change, the way the the stigma around them and the taboo. But from all the stories that I've heard, from all the, you know, things that I've heard, it I do like to give them the benefit of the doubt, but in terms of what I've heard, they are evil and they are out to, hurt people in some way. Like you have, like they, like in terms of like my job, they say there's a certain person, you have to be a certain person to be a kindergarten teacher. I think you have to have a level of hatred and anger and malice in order to follow that lifestyle, because it is such a taboo. It's such a, bad thing to be a skinwalker. So I think they really, something is pushing them so hard to do it. And so I think it does take a special person, a special kind of evil inside of their body or soul that makes them want to follow that path.
I agree.
Yeah, and I honestly think that it probably wasn't always that way, but I think now, it is. I do like to see both sides. I like to see, maybe it's just, their job and that's what they. But I also think that, like, based on my experiences, my family's experiences, I do fear and keep myself anonymous for a reason.
Yeah, and that's fair enough because these people who choose to become skinwalkers know what they're doing. They know the choices they're making, and obviously they enjoy it.
Yeah.
Or they wouldn't choose that path to begin with. You mentioned before, if their identity is found, then they will die. Maybe you'd like to expand on that a little bit?
I'm not necessarily sure of like what exactly happens, but I've found out that like if they are essentially found out, if somebody recognizes them, then they have essentially a very tragic, odd death. It's not necessarily like they take their own lives or anything like that because they're found out, but I've had heard instances where somebody was recognized um, in like a kind of odd way. So something that something I've heard in terms of like somebody being recognized was my cousin was at home and they live out outside of Gallup, which is has a pretty dense forest. And he was at home and they live out. They have a rural community. It's way out there. And so for him to have a, somebody out in the wilderness standing there is very, very odd. And so his experience was he was at home, he was outside, it was starting to get dark, and he looked up into, the tree line and he saw somebody sitting in the tree. And he's like, "Oh my god, who is that?" And he like, my cousin is very like scientific. He's a skeptic. He doesn't think, anything. He's not a traditionalist. Very level headed. Walks up to the tree and sees a man that he knows from the community in that tree. And he calls him out by name. And the man doesn't. The man acts very strangely, crawls out of the tree, and then just walks back into the forest. And my cousin was like, it was super weird. I didn't know what he was doing. And when he told his mother, who does believe in the like traditional Navajo stuff, she was like, "Oh no, that's not good. What you experienced wasn't good." And she's like, "Did you like what happened?" He's like, "No, I saw him in the tree, and I was yelling his name at him, and he crawled out of the tree and he just walked away." And he wasn't. There was some speculation that he was a skinwalker because people around the community were like mentioning it, but my cousin saw him, recognized him, called him by name, and that gentleman, like a few days, several days later, was found face down in like a puddle. Like didn't like he was sober. He didn't have like any alcohol in his system. Was face down in a puddle that was maybe 3 inches deep, and like no, like didn't he? It seemed like he just fell asleep on the ground and drowned in the puddle.
Wow.
It was a really tragic, like way to die. But there was speculation that he was a skinwalker. He was caught. My cousin saw him, out like him doing what he wasn't supposed to be doing, and essentially he died because of that. And that's my experience, like my story. But I have also heard other people saying like, if you recognize who it is, then yell at them and tell them who they are, and essentially they've lost their anonymity, and they can't go out and do bad things anymore. And so I'm not sure if they end their lives or if whatever whatever power they have over whatever power they have is drained. I'm not necessarily sure, but they do meet their end when somebody recognizes them and calls them out.
For your cousin, after seeing that and hearing about this man's death, did this alter his skepticism?
No, I don't think so. I think they did keep it under wraps in terms of like what happened. But I do have cousins that like who have you know are very very well educated. Have master's degrees, have very well paying jobs, that have had their own experiences, and will full out tell me that they don't want to talk about it. one of the first experiences that I had was um so I live outside of Gallup, like a couple miles outside of Gallup, and I we don't have paved roads. And so amongst our like family members, we would drive, on these dirt roads. And one of the first experiences that I had was I was in the vehicle with my mother and we're driving home on this dirt road. And the road is about, because we drove on the road for a while. The indention in the land was, you know, not too deep, but pretty deep, and the width of the road was maybe 6 or 7 feet. And what I experienced from that night was we're driving home and something very long. Like the vision that I have in my head of it was, very, very odd. It was a very dark figure, and it's the length of its body covered the entire road. It was very thin, very, very thin. Its torso was maybe like I imagine like a thin, very thin man. It was all black. It had very long limbs, and it walked across the road in such a speed that I can't fathom how something could run across a road so quickly. And it it wasn't off in the distance. It was right up against like if we were going even a little bit faster, we would have hit it with the vehicle. And it goes across the road and it makes eye contact with me and my mother. And all I can remember is like, you know, it's very distinctive eyes. Like I couldn't see the outline of its face. I couldn't see anything about its face. Just its very vividly white eyes. And it wasn't like it was like the pupils were not white. I can like when you shine a flashlight like at your cat or your dog and they're in the dark and you have that reflective shine back, that's what I saw in that creature's eyes as it passed the road. You know, I saw it. My mom stopped. We looked at each other, and they talk about like when you experience skinwalkers that you're not supposed to get scared because that's what they want you to do. They want you to get frightened.
Right.
And so my mom, we had a pickup and we drove up on the side of the little road, and we shined the headlights towards the ditch, and we could see whatever it was peeking back. Which, like, if it was a coyote and it almost got hit by a vehicle, I doubt that it would be standing there looking back at us. And I remember that and being like, "That's weird." Like my my memory of that was not of fear, but generally just thinking, "That's weird. What did we see?" And very, very curious. But the experience that that's the end of that first experience. But the second experience was the one that like I don't walk alone at night. I don't like like the second experience that I'm going to share is the experience that like made me fearful of like being alone out on the reservation in the dark.
Night encounter near Zenith, Arizona. True story. Glad to get this off my chest. Summer of 2013, I'm driving a packed U-Haul through a remote section of Navajo County with my 28-year-old daughter following in her car, middle of the night, pitch black, and the only radio station I could get was KTNN, the Navajo Nation. The DJ had been playing old-school country but switched it up, and suddenly the cab of the truck was filled with the otherworldly sounds of the Bear Creek Singers. We had just passed the turn-off to the ghost town of Zenith. Nobody lives out there. It's just devoid of life. All I could see was the road illuminated by the headlights and that insane music filling my mind. We're doing about 70 and suddenly he was right in front of me. The next couple of seconds goes like this. There, illuminated in the headlights, is a figure on all fours, walking across the highway directly in front of my speeding truck. In place of arms and legs, this creature had 4 long sticks, and the body was draped in a colourful Navajo-style blanket. No head, just those sticks moving back and forth, slowly propelling him across the road in the middle of the night. I swerved the truck and just missed him. I looked in the rear views and saw him approaching my daughter's headlights. Then I watched her car make the same last-second manoeuvre to avoid running him over. I was stunned and just kept driving, reassured that she was still behind me. 30 minutes later, we pulled up to her new digs in Snowflakes, Arizona, and her first words to me were, "What the fuck was that?" For the record, she is LDS and almost never swears. Since that night, I myself have moved to Snowflake and driven that same lonely stretch of the 277 fairly often at night, but never while listening to KTNN, for fear of creating conditions that would result in a repeat of the incident. I inquired with my native friends up here, and the only advice was, don't tell that story anymore. So I still think God, superstitions, and everything else is BS, but I will go to my grave believing native culture holds powerful secrets the rest of us don't understand. Skinwalkers are real. Apparently they like to mess with ignorant whites like me. Our native friends won't discuss it with us, and nobody believes me except my kid.
So when I had kind of grown up a bit, and we, again, like I said, we live in a rural area, and there's no street lights. When you go outside, it's essentially complete darkness unless it's a full moon night. And it's funny because my uncle, had internet, and I didn't have internet at my house, and so I would walk over to my uncle's, who lived about a fourth of a mile away from my house, and I would walk over, spend time on the internet, and I would walk home in the dark to my house by myself. And I was never afraid. I didn't live in the city where, people were going to come up and grab me or anything like that. And so one of those nights I stayed super late, and it was like, 10, 11. And my uncle was like, you better go home. That's enough. You better go home. And so I start walking, and I, walk a couple of feet, and I get on my bike, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to, essentially ride my bike back to my mom's house. So I get on my bike, and I start pedaling, and I'm pedaling down, the path. And, on the way home, we had a sheep corral where we would keep the sheep, and, all the sheep were, in there. It was nighttime. And I get to the sheep corral, and I just happen to glance towards it. And right next to like the little shelter that they have was something sitting. And I looked, and I stopped my bike, And I sat there and I stared at it. And I swore it was a dog. And I stared at it and I stared at it. And the moment that like pure, like I've never been so scared in my life, like until like a totally disequilibrium of like, what I had thought, you know, what being real and what being, what reality and like what I'd been told, came forward when the dog that was sitting next to the sheep corral stood up.
Wow.
I got so scared. And off in the distance, I could see like, my older sister in her vehicle and her husband, they were talking with my uncle. I rode my bike back and I was, so, so frightened. And they didn't understand what I was saying. And I was in tears. I was crying. I was trying to like, talk and tell them. And, if the funny thing is like, as adults, I feel like if a child tells, generally if a child tells you a response is supernatural, generally adults, write it off. They're like, oh, you'll be fine, you know, you don't know what you saw is kind of like the response that people have like adults have given their children when they experience something supernatural. But the difference with skinwalkers in my area is when I told what I saw, immediately the adults that were standing outside of the home took it very seriously, put me in the vehicle, no, put me inside the house. They got in the vehicle and they went looking for whatever I saw. So it not like it validated what I saw and made me fear it even more because I saw something that didn't make sense, that was so unnatural, so weird. And when I told the adults that were there, it wasn't like, oh, well, don't worry about it. You're just seeing things. It was taken with such a level of urgency and, you know, seriousness that whatever I saw was truly seen as a danger because they went after it.
Did you need to go to a medicine man and get blessed afterwards?
No, not after that time. I have had blessings before. Um, People do generally have blessings after they experience something like that, but I'm not sure why I didn't. Something that happened like a couple of years ago for here, like as another experience I've had. This one not necessarily in terms of skinwalkers and like the transformation stuff, but as I mentioned before, they are kind of like they're tied to witchcraft, the bad witchcraft. And I did experience something here at home that I do want to share, and I think that is very much connected to the skinwalker topic. So I was, I had moved to the city, and I had been living in the city. I moved in with my boyfriend, and we just purchased a new home, and we have neighbors, we have people around here that are you know we're pretty spaced out here. We're fortunate enough to live in a home where our neighbors aren't super close, but they are very very nice, very you know they look out for us.
Right.
This was, I say, 2 3 years ago. So I'm at home and I was finishing school and I have a smaller dog that yeah, that's my companion, and we have a dog door. And one day, like, was like just any other day, I tried to like have her go outside, and she didn't want to. She didn't want to go out of her dog door. And so I literally was like, "What's wrong?" Like her back hair was raised. she did not want to go outside. And so I look into my backyard and I see like a plastic bag. And so I write it off as like, oh, she's scared of that plastic bag. And I didn't investigate it further. I literally was just like, oh, go outside. And I like put her out the regular door. Like I opened the front door, I put her outside, I closed the door, and immediately she jumps back in through the dog door. She's like, nope, I do not want to go outside. And I was like, what? And so, I lock the door, I come back into the house, and I'm doing things inside the house. And then like a couple of hours later, as it starts to get dark, I walk outside. And there's a substance. It's, I don't know how to describe it. It was thick, it was like brown. It had like, I would say that was like coffee grinds. Like if somebody had coffee grinds and put it like in a bowl with water and like mix it up and then they like sprinkled it all over the outside of my house. Like from the driveway out from the street all the way to the back of the house into the backyard towards the back shed. It was pretty like a distant thing, and I was like, how did I not notice somebody outside? And it wasn't just like a little trickle of stuff. It was like this person, whoever did it, put a ton of stuff all over the side of my house. And it was on the walls, it was on the sidewalk, it was like this weird substance. I don't know how to describe it. But I'll tell you what the medicine man said in terms of that. Um, so we that substance all around the outside of my house. My boyfriend comes back and I was like, look at all this stuff. And he's like, ew, what is that? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, where did that come from? I was like, I don't know. He's like, well, you were home all day, weren't you? And I was like, I literally have no idea what that is. Who put that there? I don't know. He's like, okay, well, I'll get rid of it eventually. And then that night, you know, um, I was in my room, and the setup of our home is odd because the our living room generally, like, your living room is towards the front of your house, like towards the street. Our living room is at the back of the house, and our bedroom is toward the front of the house. So like our setup of our home is strange. And in the middle of the night, I get up to use the restroom, and as I'm going to bed, I can hear knocking, and it's in the back of the house. And I was like, if somebody wants to knock on your door, they would knock on the front door. But no, it was in the back window of our house. And so I get into bed and I poke my boyfriend and I'm like, somebody's knocking. He's like, where? And I was like, it wasn't at the back door. It was literally at like a back window. Because it didn't sound like they were knocking on a door. It sounded like they were knocking on a window. And I was like, what is that? And I was like, well, he was like, I don't know. And I was like, well, if they knock again, let's get up and check it out. And so we lay there for a bit, but then like whatever it was changed position to like the side of the house and knocked on the window of the house, not on the door, just on the side window. And so we jump up, we turn on all the lights, and we go looking around. And the window, the side window that the whatever it is knocked on, is in the dark path, like it, not very well lit. And I wasn't brave enough to go and walking down that path to go see, what was going on. And so I the next day comes and goes, and like maybe 3 or 4 days later, I'm driving to work and somebody in traffic like runs a stop sign and hits me head on and totals my car. I went to the emergency room. They checked to see if my head was okay. And, I hurt my back. I had to go into physical therapy for a couple of months, and it was so odd. Well, after my accident, I took the day off and I came home and I rested, and then curiosity got the better of me. So I went out to that window, and there was black stuff all over it. And of I am so superstitious, and I believe so much in the traditional Navajo stuff. I didn't touch it. And so I called my mom, and my mom again does believe in that, does believe in the traditional Navajo way. And so she scheduled essentially a consultation with the medicine man, and he told me that whatever came around that night had very ill intentions for me, was looking for me to get hurt, looking for me to possibly, end my life because they put he mentioned that the substance that they put on the side wall was dirt from like a grave, and it was mixed with some kind of. He didn't specify what kind of blood. I just assumed human blood, but I don't necessarily know if that's the truth. But whatever that substance, that person, that thing, whoever sprayed along the wall of the garage, the wall of my house, the wall, the sidewalk, like concocted this substance, against my house. And he's like, do not touch it. Do not touch that stuff that they sprayed on your house. He's like, you have to have somebody come out and clean it, somebody else, not you. I told him about the window, and he's like, don't touch that either. So, my boyfriend is, Caucasian, and he was instructed by my family to clean the substance off the walls and the floor outside. And it was interesting because I was having I remember very vividly as I was having the blessing ceremony that the door of the Hogan, which is where we have our ceremonies, was open, and I remember they tell you that your focus needs to be in the on the voice of the medicine man. You need to be paying attention to what he's saying, because generally, and, in one of my stories, I mentioned that like whatever was going after my sister made an appearance that night and was trying to call back whatever it was bothering her. And my eyes wandered out the Hogan door, and I could see something. I can't explain what I saw, but something running on the horizon around the Hogan. And I just got scared. I didn't say I didn't, you know, I just looked back down and I looked at the medicine man. And when he finished, his prayer, I told him that what I saw, and he's like, "Well, I'm glad you didn't look at it for too long because that could have essentially ruined what I just did for you."
Wow. Did he say what it was?
He said that so whatever it was that came to my house, I'm not sure if it was a skinwalker. It was implied that whatever came around my house was a skinwalker, but he said that the person that essentially hired the skinwalker was, and it's interesting because they can't full out give you a name.
Right.
They described a person to me that has not necessarily been, you know, kind to me in the past, but like, I always thought that my interactions with the person was cordial, and that, hey, I was always nice to them, and I really try not to, you know, bring bad things upon myself by treating others in a bad way, or like acting in a way that would make people think less of me. But apparently, this person did not like me, did not like, what was going for me, was essentially jealous, and was hired, the people that do not follow the blessing way to have something happen to me that would essentially end my life, have me really hurt, have me lose my job, something, some kind of ill will.
Wow. And it almost succeeded.
Yeah,
Once the medicine man did this blessing for you, did you have any issues after that?
I did lose my car. I, did have to go to physical therapy, but I find that, you know, essentially what the misfortune that was happening to me ended and was sent back at that person.
Oh, goodness me. No wonder you're sharing your stuff because one, it's a validation for you, and two, it helps you to come to terms with what you've experienced, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
I feel like it's kind of interesting because I experience people that don't necessarily think that my stories are true, and they're allowed to have their skepticism, but I I I have my truth. I know what happened to me.
right.
I think that my stories provide a validation not only for me, but for people that have also experienced like totally horrifying things, misfortune, and I feel like my stories are scary, but I they hold like that truth in them that like I hope that somebody sees them and they're like, oh my gosh, I've seen this too, and just validates that I am not crazy, I'm not a crazy person.
I wondered if that was part of the reason why you were sharing it, because reading your story in the Skinwalker subreddit, that thought occurred to me. That might be one of the reasons you were sharing it, to help others, because you can tell the stories on there that are genuine and the ones that aren't. They have a distinctly different feel to them.
So this one's my mother's story. So this was when I was an infant, and my dad, who my he passed when I was younger. He was a electrician, so he would get contracted, and he would, because the reservation is so small, he would have to go elsewhere in order to work. And so this was when around the time, I was maybe like a toddler, and I was at home with my mother. She was home alone with me, and she said that she was, in bed. It was dark, and she heard her car door close. And she was, because we live out in the middle of out in the middle of nowhere, that is highly disturbing to hear your car door close when you're home alone with a child and you live in the middle of nowhere. It's very, very off-putting. And so when our home has like, it didn't have like a regular, open, close, shut door. It had a glass sliding door for our front door. And now that I think about it, I'm mortified by that thought of having a glass sliding door as your front door, because she said that she looked out and she saw something outside, and it was inside of the cab digging around, like looking through her things. And she put like, went out to the front. I'm still in bed. She goes out to the front and looks out that glass sliding door, and she sees whatever it is. And so she's like, whatever it is, I'm going to shoot it. She's like, if it's somebody stealing my stuff, I'm going to shoot them. And so she loads the gun, and the glass sliding door is super loud when you open it. You can't like crack it open. It's as loud as can be, and so she slides the sliding glass door open just a little bit and points the gun out. And she said she's like she wasn't even scared to like shoot her vehicle. She was just like, whatever it is, it's it's this is highly disturbing, whatever it is. And she says she's aiming at it. It notices that she opens the door and it turns its focus toward her. And she says it started moving, having like erratic movements. She calls it dancing. She was like, it looked like it was dancing. And she said it started to make its way closer and closer to her. And she said that she starts pulling the trigger on the rifle, and it's not going off. And she's pulling it and pulling it and pulling it, trying to like shoot what now is essentially coming up the walkway of our house. Dancing, still dancing. And I asked her, I'm like, well, how was it dancing? And she's like, it literally had its arms above its head, but like its arms were above its head, but not straight. She said as it walked, it would contort its arms and move them in a weird fashion as it took steps towards her. And so she's like, eventually it came super close to the door, and she said she shut her eyes and began to pray in Navajo, and the gun went off. And she said she opened her eyes and it wasn't there.
Wow.
And she said her legs got so weak that she just like fell down like right at the front door, and like the sliding door was still open. The rifle was still halfway out the door. She said she sat there and she just wept because she was so frightened by her experience that she had. And she's like she you know her retelling of this story is so genuine, and she gets so shaken and so like essentially she like I don't know how to explain it. When she tells the story, it makes her uncomfortable.
Right. Right, because it brings back all those emotions.
Yes. And so that was one of the stories that I've heard where she you know usually the stories that I've heard, we have to have in terms of like blessing, something that blesses the gun, or something that blesses the bullet. So they put like cedar ash on bullets. They put cedar ash on the gun, and then the gun will work. They say that they even tell us like if you're walking home at night, you need to put ashes on your forehead, ashes on you, so that whatever's out there doesn't bother you or touch you. And so she said that, well, I've noticed that that's one of the only times that she or a person hasn't had to put some kind of blessing on the weapon in order for it to work.
But she did say a prayer, though.
Yes, she did. She does mention that she closed her eyes and began to pray in Navajo, and that's finally when the gun went off. But when she opened her eyes, nothing was there. So essentially, like maybe like this is just a thought that I've had, that she started to pray in Navajo, and whatever it was ran off, which allowed the gun to go off.
Oh, good point. That's probably a very good reason. Wow, that's really interesting. Your poor mum must have been so terrified because she would have had no way to get out. If this thing was in her car initially, no escape. And where would she go? And with you in the house, she would have been really scared. I could see that. I could see that. That's pretty scary. Wow. Sounds like you guys have had some, like, your family has had some very interesting experiences.
I'm sure I'm sure in terms of Native families, all of them have their own set of Skinwalker stories, but I feel like I am actively putting them out there, and so you know it's kind of interesting because I'm putting myself out there and I'm hearing people telling me their Skinwalker stories, and in response, like I think like people are so scared to tell them. They're so scared to bring up something horrible that's happened to them, and so I think that that's where like the kind of skepticism comes in, where like, oh well, you're the only one telling these Skinwalker stories. But I think every single family on that reservation has had some experience, one or another, of like where they have had to have, protection, people walking on the roof, seeing something running across the road, seeing something abnormal, and people don't talk about it and don't share those experiences. So I think they just write them off of like, okay, maybe I'm crazy. And I think again that's why I like to share my stories. Is like, no, you're not crazy. No, your experience is not. It is abnormal in terms of like you don't go in. Not everybody has these skinwalker experiences. But I my family has experienced things, and I'm sure there are many families out on the reservation that do.
I'm really grateful to you for taking the time to share what you have with us. That's really appreciated immensely.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's good to talk about it and not necessarily like get like a dirty look about it, because sometimes when I'm the weird relative that like, well, what kind of stories have you heard and stuff like that. And it does, people do get put off by like my questions, but I see it as, you know, getting them out there, wanting people to understand that like there's a bigger world out there in, in native culture. You can't just take things at face value.
Right.
Things, and there's experiences that we cannot fully comprehend.
Correct. Oh, look, thank you so very much. I'm really, really grateful.
You too. Thank you so much.
We've come to the end of our 2 episodes on the subject of skinwalkers and have heard experiences from people kind and brave enough to share their stories. We have had a very interesting conversation with my guest and heard their personal experiences, as well as ones that have happened to family. It has been, at least for me, and hopefully for you all as well, an interesting journey into this part of the Shadowlands. If you enjoyed these episodes, then please leave a positive rating and written review on iTunes. Who knows, you may hear your review read out at the end of an episode, so get writing. And of course, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favourite podcasting platform so you don't miss an episode. As with the previous episode, our music was called Apache Moon by Watchwolf, copyright 2008, licensed under Creative Commons. For more information, visit the podcast website, www.walkingtheshadowlands.com. And don't forget to tell your friends, tell your family, tell your workmates about our show. Encourage them to listen and subscribe also. The more the merrier. As always, I would love to hear your experiences, all sorts. You can email me at shadowlands@yahoo.com. And please consider supporting this show on patreon.com. You can check out the link on our website. Also, check out our Walking the Shadowlands Facebook page. Like and follow it for hints about our next upcoming episode. Or follow us on Instagram. Thanks for joining us. Thank you so much for listening. Tonight, today, wherever you are in this beautiful world of ours. We'll see you this time next week.
Thanks for listening.